The Queen's Platinum Jubilee, a record-breaking 70 years on the throne celebrated by events across the UK, a 4-day bank holiday weekend, and, as you might have heard, the awarding of so-called city status to a number of towns in and around the country. In 2022, in celebration of the Jubilee, 8 towns were awarded city status: Doncaster, Colchester and Milton Keynes in England, Dunfermline in Scotland, Wrexham in Wales, Bangor in Northern Ireland, and outside the UK, Douglas on the Isle of Man and Stanley in the Falkland Islands. From later on this year, these 8 towns will forever be known as cities. But what exactly does that mean? What's the difference between a city and a town? And how can your town become a city in the future? Well, stay with us here and we'll dive into the story of city status in the UK. You know what a city is, right? By the end of this year, there will be 76 of them in the UK. Places like Liverpool, Edinburgh, York, Cardiff, Glasgow, Newcastle, Belfast. These are all obviously cities. But what about Ripon, Chelmsford, Wells, Armagh, St David's, or St Asaph? At first glance, you might not know that these are cities just like the big names you know like the back of your hand. So what is a city in the UK? Well, I suppose it's best that we start off by clearing up a couple of common misconceptions with regards to the difference between a city and a town in this country. Misconception number 1. You need a cathedral to be a city. This is the most common theme brought up when talking about city status in the UK. And yes, in effect, this was once the case. Sort of. The link between having a cathedral and city status only applied to England and Wales, and a number of so-called cathedral cities, Lincoln, Winchester, Norwich and Gloucester just to name a few, did indeed gain city status in the year that their church was designated a cathedral. Now crucially, after the English Reformation in the mid-16th century, when the country split with the Vatican and the Catholic Church, the convention about having a cathedral only applied to Anglican cathedrals, those belonging to the Church of England. This is important, because a number of cities in England and Wales today may have a Catholic cathedral, but no Anglican cathedral, Leeds being the most notable example. Meanwhile, there are a number of towns which do have an Anglican cathedral, but no city status, Blackburn and Guildford being just 2 examples. Either way, the convention about having a cathedral eventually became redundant after the Industrial Revolution, where many new urban centres like Birmingham, Liverpool, Sheffield and Hull gained such economic significance that it was mad to not call them a city, despite them not having a cathedral. Birmingham, which gained its city status in 1889, was the first place in England to become a city without having an Anglican cathedral. So no, you don't need a cathedral to gain city status. Misconception number 2. You need a large population to be a city. This makes sense. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a city as a large town, and for most of us, that is what separates a town from a city: size. Outside of the UK, it's fairly apparent what is and what isn't a city. Tokyo, Paris, Moscow, Sydney. These are all cities to us simply because they're big. But in the UK, that doesn't wash. Including the 6 newcomers from within the UK in 2022, 26 of the country's 76 cities have a population of less than 100,000 according to the ONS, the smallest being Little St David's in Pembrokeshire, home to just 1,408 people. Conversely, places like Northampton, home to over 200,000 people, and Huddersfield, with over 170,000 residents, don't have city status, and instead are simply seen as large towns. So no, city status in the UK doesn't depend on population whatsoever. But what about Scotland and Northern Ireland? Most of the rules and conventions we've discussed so far, while now applying to the UK as a whole, historically related only to England and Wales. Scotland was an entirely independent nation separate from England until at least 1603, when the Scottish King James VI became King of England and Ireland and united the 3 kingdoms under one crown. Officially, Scotland and England only united into one nation in 1707, but the rules on city status wouldn't merge until 1889. Before then, Scotland had their own rules, and when I say their own rules, there weren't actually any. No links with the cathedral, nor with population. For much of its history, there was no such thing as a city in Scotland. The closest thing in the country to a city for most of its history was a so-called royal borough, simply a town given a high status by order of the Scottish monarch. But royal boroughs were a lot more common than cathedral cities in England, and by the time of the nation's union in 1707, there were as many as 70 royal boroughs in Scotland, ranging from major settlements like Edinburgh and Perth, to far smaller places like Wick, Dingwall, Stranraer, Falkland and Inverary, which has a population of just over 500 people today. The first place in Scotland to gain city status under the process as we know it today was Dundee, although that had been a royal borough since as far back as the 12th century. Royal boroughs were officially abolished in Scotland in 1975, and so come the end of 2022, there will be just 8 cities in Scotland: Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling, Perth, Inverness, Aberdeen, Dundee, and the new boy, Dunfermline. Over in Northern Ireland, meanwhile, there will be 6 cities by the end of the year: Belfast, Derry or Londonderry, Lisburn, Armagh, Newry, and newcomer Bangor. Now, given that Northern Ireland as we know it today was only created in 1921, most of its cities have gained their status much in line with the system that's become common in Great Britain, although there are a couple of caveats to that. Belfast, for one, gained its city status before the creation of Northern Ireland, being granted the title in 1888, and it was the first place in the UK to be awarded city status without an Anglican cathedral, being followed a year later by Birmingham and Dundee in Great Britain. Derry, meanwhile, has held city status ever since 1604, when it was awarded a charter when it was a part of the Kingdom of Ireland, held under the crown of James VI I, who ruled over all 3 kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland. So, we've picked apart the misconceptions surrounding city status and the differing rules for each nation of the UK. But let's return to the original question. What is city status in the UK today? Well, with England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland now operating under the same rules, it's become standard practice that city status is simply awarded by the monarch, who can be petitioned at any time by a wannabe city, without any specific criteria. Now, during the 19th century, when the cathedral rule was becoming redundant, this new convention did become a little confusing for some. Take the city of Ripon in Yorkshire, the 3rd smallest city in England today, home to just over 16,000 people. In 1836, Ripon's parish church was upgraded to the status of cathedral, and given what had come in the last few hundred years, the town just assumed it was now a city. Now, despite the cathedral convention in the past, towns had always been required to petition the monarch for a charter, which would award it city status. But this was generally a formality for most places. Ripon, thinking the same would apply to it too, just started calling itself the City of Ripon from 1836 onwards, but it soon became apparent that they still needed to petition the monarch, which they didn't do until 1865, though the city status was eventually granted without a hitch. The process of petitioning the monarch for city status has officially been the case since 1927, and in the last 20 years, the awarding of city status has become synonymous with Queen Elizabeth II's Jubilee celebrations, with a lengthy bidding process and competition between towns wanting to become cities playing out in the lead up to the Jubilee. Towns can still become a city outside of the Jubilee period. Southend-on-Sea gained city status last year, in 2021, as a memorial to its former MP David Amos. And the door is technically open for anyone to apply at any time. So that's the answer to our question. To become a city in the UK today, all you have to do is apply to the monarch, and there's no specific criteria. Simple, right? Well, yes, but there's one more oddity about city status that we haven't mentioned, and it's a place that you almost certainly think is a city. London. What we all know as London, one of the world's largest cities, home to as many as 14 million people, isn't actually a city. There is a city known as the City of London, but bizarrely, it's actually the smallest city by population in England. The City of London has had city status since time immemorial, based on the famous St Paul's Cathedral, but it only covers the historic square mile at the very centre of London, which is only home to around 10,000 permanent residents. Next door to the City of London is another city, known as the City of Westminster, which gained its city status in 1540 after Westminster Abbey became a cathedral. Westminster Abbey actually lost its cathedral status just 10 years later in 1550, but Westminster retained its city status, meaning that there are two cities to be found in London, but London itself isn't a city at all. Confused again? Me too. But when push comes to shove, city status is nothing more than a symbolic title. We may sometimes think of the UK cities as occupying a level above its towns, but the truth is that whether a city or a town, there's an illustrious history behind each and every place in the country. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like, let me know what you think about city status today. And if you're from outside the UK, let me know how city status is granted in your country. Thank you for watching.